America at war with itself. Brother against brother, and neighbor against neighbor, a bitter, sad, and tragic affair. Yet the Civil War was the making of the United States, a fiery trial, in the immortal words of its greatest president. 4 years of blood and horror, sweat and tears, death and destruction. A quarter of those who took part did not survive to tell the tale. Almost as many died as in all the other wars America has fought before and since. It was a war that began with cavalry charges and infantry clashes redolent of Napoleonic times, but that ended with slaughter by massed rifles on a murderous scale. It was the first war to be covered by the camera, and the first to be fought between literate masses. Some of the diaries and letters written by those who participated make powerful reading even today. But to those who fell on the field of battle, it will always remain an unfinished story. One of the most evocative sounds in the world, suggesting the frontier and the West. In the 85 years between the War of Independence and the Civil War, the West was where the United States was growing fastest. And it was in the West, of course, where North and South first came to blows over slavery. Yet at a time when the sheer size of the country, as well as the differences between its peoples and regions, was threatening the survival of the great federal experiment, keeping it on the rails, as it were, was that reducer of the miles, the train. Although a relative newcomer to the American scene, the train would play a vital role in the Civil War. It was the first war in which it did. Without the Iron Road, the United States would never have flourished. By the eve of the Civil War, the 4 million Americans who had broken away from Britain had become 31 million. And the original 13 states of the Union had increased to 33. But not everyone welcomed this expansion, certainly not those living in the South. Nothing symbolizes the Southern way of life before the Civil War more than the great plantation houses that survive today in all their splendor. The South then boasted far more millionaires than anywhere else in the land. Most of these fortunes have been built on growing tobacco, rice, sugar, or more often than not, cotton. The people who worked these plantations, which set the South apart from the rest of the country, were slaves. Their lifestyles were, of course, very different from those of their masters. Building such magnificent mansions, Southerners firmly believed they had brought the best of Western civilization to the American continent. Yankees were dismissed as mere barbarians. A popular saying then was that the Northerner loved to make money, the Southerner to spend it. The South had always been a class society, the least changing region of the land. Many would argue that was its problem. While the North became increasingly industrial and city-oriented, the South remained agricultural and rural. Slavery, though, was the major difference. Although sprung from a revolution that proclaimed all men to be equal, the United States, by the 19th century, had become the largest ever slave-owning nation. The first Negroes were brought to Virginia in 1619, 12 years after the establishment of the initial settlement there, and 12 months before the Mayflower reached Massachusetts Bay. Most slaves would be bought and sold in auction at least once in their lifetimes, with all the degradation and brutal upheaval such a transaction implied. Knowing little else but work from an early age, fed, dressed, and housed at their owner's whim, and expected to show humility to any white within sight, slaves were the absolute chattels of their masters, who could, in effect, do what they liked with them. The system was certainly profitable for some. Yet out of the bleakness came that most moving of music, the Negro spiritual, which vividly expressed the yearning for freedom by blacks and their surrender to sadness. While cotton growing was so lucrative, the slaves would not be freed willingly. Demand for cotton was escalating, from England in particular. By the eve of the Civil War, the South was supplying Europe with nearly 90% of its cotton. Cotton amounted to more than half of total United States exports. Hence the boast among many Southerners that cotton was king and ruled the American economy. But as the South became ever more dependent on cotton, it became ever more dependent on slavery and determined not to give it up. The treatment of slaves varied, of course, from plantation to plantation. Some owners were more humane than others. Even so, it was undoubtedly harsh.
We're talking about the fact that human beings were kept in bondage, and I think that anytime that occurs, it's harsh. But the advertisements for runaway slaves reveal that there was also that animalistic aspect of harshness too. Owners had to describe their slaves if they wanted them back, and all too often they would speak of this kind of, that kind of mark, which was a mark of violence. One remembers also that the 19th century instructed parents to punish their children, so that the 19th century would punish any ward of any kind, punished by whipping, etc., to the extent that in some communities they had laws regulating the number of lashes that one could receive. Although one must remember that every owner was his own law and in a position to decide himself how much punishment should be meted out.
Blacks could only be accepted in Southern society as slaves. And I think to understand the South's defense of slavery is not just a question of the obvious economic advantages slavery offered to those who owned it, but also the extent to which slavery as a system kept the blacks in a position where non-slave holders, even though they may not like slavery, they could accept the presence of blacks. It's interesting to note in this regard that Northerners had a real antipathy towards the presence of blacks, and really were not at all eager to see blacks emancipated if it meant they were going to go north. Southerners were fighting to maintain a way of life.
Well, the antebellum North is where segregation was invented. When emancipation came to the North in the aftermath of the American Revolution, it was more or less taken as a given that integration was not likely to be possible. And in fact, where integration did occur, and in New York State most certainly this is a fairly vivid example, prior to 1822, it was possible for a black to vote. It was possible for a black to more or less become part of the ongoing social norms within the state of New York. The Constitution of 1822, which was a reform constitution, a democratic constitution, specifically revoked the vote from the blacks. If you came to New York City, for all practical purposes, all forms of transportation were segregated. All forms of public facilities were segregated. Overall, I think what you can say is that segregation is a northern invention, and it may explain for why after the Civil War, when the Southerners attempted to introduce segregation and were immediately shot down, they were somewhat puzzled because what they felt they were doing was simply imitating the victorious North.
Hypocritical though many Northerners may have been on race, they did focus attention not just on the iniquities of slavery, but on the misdeeds of slave owners.
Northerners now began not only to condemn the institution of slavery, but they also began to condemn slaveholders as men of no principle, as men who were themselves immoral, as men who were themselves unchristian, etc., etc. So that slaveholders who might have conceded there was something wrong about the institution of slavery, who might have said that in the long run perhaps we ought to get rid of it, would not concede that they themselves were the bad guys that Northerners began to insist that they were.
Perhaps the single most powerful piece of propaganda the anti-slavery or so-called abolitionist movement produced was Harriet Beecher Stowe's Uncle Tom's Cabin, which first appeared in 1851. An instant bestseller in the United States, it was astonishingly successful in Europe, too, selling millions of copies in its first year of publication. For many today, Mrs. Stowe's characters appear stereotyped and her simple tales somewhat mawkish. But its account of white man's inhumanity to his weaker black brother struck a guilty chord in the North. It was a favorite subject also for that most Victorian of family pastimes, the lantern slide reading.
"Walk that Tom up here right away," said Legree. "The old cuss is at the bottom of this here whole matter." Tom heard the message with a forewarning heart, for he knew all the plan of the fugitive's escape. "Well, Tom," said Legree, "do you know I've made up my mind to kill you?" "It's very likely, Massa," said Tom calmly. It was but a moment, and Legree, foaming with rage, smote his victim to the ground. They washed his wounds. They provided a rude bed of some refuse cotton for him to lie down on. When George entered the shed, he felt his head giddy and his heart sick. "Uncle Tom, my poor old friend, I've come to buy you and take you home." "Oh, Massa George, you're too late. The Lord's bought me and is going to take me home." And with a smile, he fell asleep.
But whatever the impact of Uncle Tom's Cabin on the abolitionist movement, the most emotionally charged episode in the developing clash between North and South over slavery occurred here, where the Shenandoah River joins the Potomac, some 50 miles northwest of Washington, Harper's Ferry, the location then of a government weapons factory. In October 1859, an anti-slavery hardliner, already wanted for suspected murder, led an attack on the undefended arsenal, aiming to arouse Southern blacks and to use the captured guns to strike at the hated institution of slavery on its home soil. John Brown, whose raid this was, had with him only 18 men. It was a fiasco, and as a call to arms, fell on deaf ears. His little group included 5 Negroes and 3 of his own sons. Soon surrounded by a larger force, most of them were killed or captured. Brown was tried for treason against the state of Virginia, found guilty, and with 6 of his followers executed within the month. The incident touched the South at its rawest nerve, the fear of an armed slave revolt. In the feverish mood that flourished then in the North, John Brown was crowned a martyr. The day he was hanged, bells tolled in many New England churches, while groups prayed openly for his soul. His testament read, "I, John Brown, am now quite certain that the crimes of this guilty land will never be purged away but with blood." Within a few years, Yankee soldiers would march into battle to the words of a new anthem. John Brown's body lies a-moldering in the grave, but his soul goes marching on. As the map of the United States filled in during the decades before the Civil War, Southerners became obsessed with the balance between slave and non-slave, or so-called free labor states. Because under the American Constitution, each state, no matter its size, sent 2 senators to Congress, where the Senate had the power effectively to block changes in legislation. Hitherto, the South had controlled the Senate and was determined to go on doing so for as long as possible. In this way, it could prevent any anti-slavery proposals becoming law. Bargaining and compromise had been the South's weapons to date, but the room for compromise was becoming less, and the opportunities for bargaining far fewer. The North was beginning to take a tougher line. Arguments whether slavery should be admitted to former Indian territories like Kansas and Nebraska brought people to blows. Both were north of the Missouri Compromise line, and hence should have been non-slave. That Southerners were trying to edge slavery into hitherto agreed forbidden areas alarmed many Northerners. The dispute broke up old political alliances and led to the formation of the Republican Party and the emergence of Abraham Lincoln, Honest Abe, the rail splitter turned successful lawyer whose parents were semi-illiterate pioneers from Kentucky who had settled in the Midwest. A former Whig with a reputation for pragmatism and realism, combined with a deep devotion to the Union, Lincoln had broken with his previous party over slavery.
Lincoln comes to the scene in 1860 as in some ways a surprise. He was not a well-known politician prior to 1858 when he engaged in his famous debates with Stephen A. Douglas, and those certainly gave him a prominence in Republican and in national politics that he otherwise wouldn't have had. But I think the event that really brought Lincoln to the fore, and which in a sense is at the root of the coming of the war itself, was the creation of the Republican Party in 1855-56, a party which was dedicated to questioning the existence of slavery in the territories. And Lincoln quickly became a prominent member within that party. And when the time came in 1860 for a candidate to be chosen, he seemed to be one who had grasped the issue of slavery in a fairly moderate way, as compared with, say, Seward, who was much more outspoken and had been much more outspoken on the question than Lincoln.
Here in Charleston, South Carolina, the fateful 12 months that led up to the Civil War began and ended. Charleston then was a city of 35,000 souls where the two rivers, the Ashley and the Cooper, came together in the local boast to form the Atlantic Ocean. Charlestonians were given to extravagant behavior as well as extravagant comments. They considered themselves the epitome of Southernness, and their fine city the focus of Southern traditions and ideals. In April 1860, Charleston's gracious houses hosted the delegates to the Democratic Party convention, come to nominate a candidate for the presidential election that November. During the months following John Brown's raid, the atmosphere in the South had been charged. Militia units stepped up their training. Meanwhile, the convention could not agree on a candidate and adjourned. Before it met again, the Republicans had nominated Abraham Lincoln. When the Democrats reconvened, they ended up with 2 candidates, which helped ensure Lincoln's victory, though not before Southerners had asserted that a Republican success would justify their leaving the Union and forming a Confederacy. The 7 states of the Deep South did not even wait for Lincoln to be inaugurated as president. South Carolina, as usual, led the way. Within hours of Lincoln's election, the state legislature there had called for a special convention to consider secession. Within the month, it had met at Charleston and agreed unanimously to take South Carolina out of the Union. Mississippi, Florida, Alabama, Georgia, Louisiana, and Texas all followed within a matter of weeks. In February 1861, representatives from these 7 seceding states met at Montgomery, Alabama, to elect a senator from Mississippi, Jefferson Davis, as their president, and to agree on a constitution for the so-called Confederate States of America. Southerners flocked to the colors. Entire families rushed to join their state militias. Young bloods stared into the newfangled camera lens. Their weapons perhaps primitive, but their patriotism fired as they hurried to be among the 100,000-strong force Jefferson Davis was recruiting to oppose the Federal Army, then a mere 16,000. Some of the rebel recruits even brought their slaves, like knights of old with their esquires. That these slaves might be aiding a fight to perpetuate their own bondage was an irony not lost on many Northerners. Meanwhile, in Washington, the unfinished new capital seemed to symbolize the North's political disarray. Under a quirk, then, of the American Constitution, 5 months would pass between the president being elected and taking office. Here in Washington, the reins of government, at this supremely critical time for the Union, were still in the hands of the previous Democratic and generally pro-Southern administration, which, not surprisingly, showed little inclination to act decisively against the seceded states. Work went on to complete the Capitol dome even while the new president was being smuggled into the city incognito because of fears for his life. Washington was, of course, surrounded by slave states whose loyalty was far from certain. Buchanan, the outgoing president, was by now thoroughly discredited. Congress was deserted as many Confederate supporters hastened southwards. A crowd of 30,000 came to see Abraham Lincoln inaugurated as the 16th President of the United States. Sharpshooters were posted to discourage Southern attempts to assassinate him. In his address, Lincoln vowed to avoid war, but not everyone was convinced he could do so now. Charleston, appropriately enough, was where the dramatic events that finally led to war took place. The presence within some of the seceding states of federal forts manned by federal garrisons presented problems, none more so than Fort Sumter here in Charleston Harbor. Soon it had taken on a symbolic value out of all proportion to its military importance. The Confederacy feared that its case for recognition as a sovereign nation would be compromised as long as another power maintained an armed presence within one of its main harbors, while for the federal authority, it was a question of the loss of face if the forts were surrendered to states in rebellion. Just a month after Lincoln's inauguration, Washington made a final attempt to relieve and replenish Fort Sumter. An unarmed convoy was due to arrive off Charleston the night of April 11th, 12th. 2 days before that, the local Confederate general called on Major Robert Anderson, the federal commander of the fort, to surrender. Anderson waited 24 hours before declining, realizing full well the inevitable response, but trusting in a more divine providence. Knowing the Northern relief ships were at hand, the Confederates began firing on Fort Sumter at 4:30 a.m. on April 12, 1861, watched by a crowd of eager Charlestonians. The bombardment lasted 34 hours, with more than 4,000 rounds being shot off in the direction of the luckless fort, and a mere 1,000 fired in reply before Anderson decided he and his men had had enough. damage to the fort was extensive, though miraculously no one had been killed. 4 of the garrison had been wounded, as had 4 of the Confederate gunners on shore. The only deaths happened later when a Federal soldier lost his life while firing a salute during the surrender ceremony. Another was fatally injured in an ensuing explosion. Alas, they were to be merely the first of many as America's bloodiest conflict got underway. With the secessionists having fired on the flag, Northerners rallied to defend the Union. Baffled and bemused before, they now knew where they stood and seemed relieved. The months of inactivity gave way to frenzied preparations. Patriotism reared its head as the northern states vied to supply recruits for the Union cause. Most were eager to reply in kind for Sumter as soon as possible. In the South, Sumter lifted secessionist fervor to fever pitch. Everyone, it seemed, wanted to volunteer, anxious not to miss out on the great adventure, convinced it was an opportunity of a lifetime. Sumter appeared to confirm the conventional wisdom that one Southerner could whip 10 Yankees. The Times correspondent reported from Charleston, "Secession is the fashion here. Young ladies sing for it, old ladies pray for it, young men are dying to fight for it." But Sumter had destroyed for the South the dream that its independence could be won without a fight. It brought, however, 4 more states into the Confederate camp: Virginia, North Carolina, Tennessee, and Arkansas. Lines were being drawn and positions taken. The Charleston batteries had ended the years of bickering over slavery and states' rights. Might was now to decide it all. Most believed, though, that the war would not last long. Settled, no doubt, in a single gallant and hopefully bloodless encounter, and then they could return to living again. No one had any idea of the enormity and tragic nature of the struggle upon which they were embarking, least of all those Northerners who now flocked to the colors. Those who lived here in Vermont, for instance, close to the Canadian border, could not have been further away from the arguments over slavery. So why did they go to war? Northerners were as righteously devoted to their way of life as Southerners to theirs. Theirs was not a life, though, based on lush plantations and masses of slaves. Few in the North had any direct experience of slavery. People here favored small communities, free labor, the right to better oneself. Why then should they support a military struggle to coerce back into the Union rebel states which had been a thorn in their flesh for many years? Why did they rush now to take up arms against the slave South when they had for so long been reluctant to translate their disapproval into direct action against it? Southerners grossly underestimated the devotion Northerners had to their own ideas of freedom, as well as their deep pride in the Union. People here resented the threat to their way of life, which, they believed, the Confederacy posed, and Sumter confirmed their worst fears. Within the day of Sumter's surrender, Lincoln summoned into Union service thousands of militiamen to suppress the South's rebellion. Tearful farewells became the norm as Northerners answered their president's call. The sounds of recruiting rallies filled the air. "So impatient did I become for starting," said one volunteer, "that I felt like 10,000 pins were pricking me in every part of my body." The choice of color for their uniforms, rather than the prospect of terrible carnage ahead, occupied the minds of the new soldiers. Lincoln's problem, though, was getting these troops into Washington. Rumors were rife of a coup attempt against him.
Here you have this new president, a minority president, just come to Washington in a difficult time, and he's fully aware that the United States regulars number no more than 14,000. And of course, most of them are not in the East, they're out West, defending us, in quotation, against the Native Americans or Indians. So he arrives in Washington, he has 653 men to protect the district, and he wants to get Northern troops into Washington as quickly as possible. But when the first troops try to make the change from stations, in those days we didn't have monopolies, and so therefore you had to get off of one train station and then you had to get yourself somehow 3 miles to another train station. And in this progress from station to station, the Baltimore mobs pick up the bottles and the stones and they hurl them against some soldiers who begin firing, and as a result, the first casualties of the Civil War take place in Baltimore. And Lincoln was very worried about what this meant.
Lincoln was worried about many things in those early weeks of the war, but raising recruits was not one of them, as the state governors vied to exceed their quotas. More men offered their services than the authorities could easily handle, let alone equip and uniform. Patriotism quickly became the mood in the North, as it had been in the South for many months. Lincoln relied on ships for getting his troops into position around his capital, with the railways blocked in Baltimore and elsewhere in Maryland. The North's greater resources in this, as in most other things, were to stand it in good stead in the coming struggle. Even so, Washington's garrison was at first so puny that the White House had to rely for its defense on civilian volunteers, and this at a time when the front line was the Potomac River itself, since Confederate Virginia lay just across it and was in full view of the White House windows. Fortunately, the threat of such an invasion was not a real one at the war's outset, though the measures taken to discourage it were not impressive. But the capital's defenses soon took on a more solid look. As well as facing rebel Virginia across the Potomac, Washington was surrounded on the north by Maryland, a slave state whose loyalty to the Union was unsure. Lincoln also worried about the other border slave states, Kentucky, Tennessee, and Missouri. Tennessee had already opted for the Confederacy, but Lincoln was determined to win it back. That no one before had ever conquered a territory the size of the South did not deter the North from its preparations for war. While the North knew that in order to win it had to defeat the South in battle, the Confederates did not have to defeat anyone. They could remain on the defensive forever, and if the Union eventually got tired of fighting and quit, independence would be theirs. The gaily colored uniforms belied the seriousness of it all. Northerners were anxious to bring Southerners to their senses by depriving them of outside help and by impressing them with the Union's resolve to end their rebellion. Delay suited the South while it sought foreign recognition. Washington was soon surrounded by tents. Equipment would never be a problem for the North. Its greater resources and easier access to foreign suppliers gave it an edge from the start. It also had almost a 4-to-1 advantage in white manpower. As the summer wore on and discipline within the camps relaxed, the onus was on the North to make the first move. The snag was that life under canvas was beginning to take on a separate existence. Food was always in good supply on the Union side, though the diet of fatty bacon and hard biscuit became fairly boring. By contrast, The rebel soldiers often went hungry. One thing that was to have considerable impact on the war was photography, then only 20 years old and still a matter for experts.
There was one basic process used worldwide, and that was called the wet plate process. It gets its name because the glass plate negative actually had to be damp in order to be light sensitive. So the photographer had to actually have a darkroom wagon with him on the spot. He had to make the negative, expose it, and develop it all within about 10 minutes before that plate dried. Now, it's a very, very cumbersome process, but there is absolutely nothing primitive about the results. The photographs, in fact, are superior to a lot of what is taken today. You had two main popular forms that Civil War photographs came in. Probably the most popular of all, and this was for studio portraiture, was the carte de visite. It's a French word. It means visiting card. These became popular in the United States in 1860, and they very quickly attracted a great deal of attention. They were relatively inexpensive. They could be mass-produced. They were very convenient to send through the mails. And in 1861, when the soldiers go off to war, more had their portraits taken as carte de visites than any other form. And very quickly, people realized that these things would fit very nicely in albums, so you had a sub-industry created, and that is the carte de visite albums, and you'd have pictures of your Uncle Harry and your grandfather, and also your uncle who was in the service. And the photographs were very, very important to the servicemen and to the families back home. Now, as far as field photography, battlefield photography is concerned, the stereo view was king. These three-dimensional stereo views were produced in large quantities. I would venture to say that of the actual battlefield outdoor series that were recorded, 75% were originally taken with the twin-lens stereo camera. And if you've never seen an original Civil War view in 3D, it's very dramatic. And the stereo view was for the Civil War populace what TV is for us today.
Adjacent images seen through a special viewer produced a three-dimensional effect. Newspapers and magazines could not reproduce photographs then. They relied on woodcuts based on those images. But collecting such photographs became enormously popular. Sets of them were sold through print shops and photographic galleries. The most famous being Matthew Brady's in New York, who was responsible for many of the more important Civil War photographs. His team covered the battlefields from the northern side. By the time of the Civil War, some 3,000 photographers were making a living in the United States. One of the first things soldiers did on joining up was to have their photographs taken for friends and family at home.
The most moving photos are those, I think, of the young men going off to war, particularly in 1861, when no one had any idea of what this experience was going to be like, and they all expected a summer's lark.
The summer's lark was about to end and the real fighting to begin, though the Union soldiers' families did not see it that way. They thought the coming battle would be a bit of a lark, too, and stayed on to watch. Many of the men had volunteered for only 3 months and wanted some action before returning home. They had expected the war won by now. Northern public opinion had been demanding revenge since Sumter. And once the Confederacy had the nerve, in June, to move its capital to Richmond, a mere 120 miles from Washington, a clash was inevitable. Both sides brought up their guns, eager and confident. The cream of Washington society rode out as if for a picnic to see the rebels get whipped. Ordinary folk came too, anxious not to miss the great spectacle. Some brought their black servants. All believed the war would be won by nightfall. July 21st, a Sunday, was when the North felt ready to strike. Ground sheets in hand, the crowds hurried for the best view. Generals' wives, congressmen, even a member of Lincoln's cabinet. Manassas, 25 miles south of Washington, was the place destined for the first battle. The French-style Zouaves from Louisiana hurried to the Confederacy's defense. The North's advance had hardly been concealed. They had taken 3 days to get into position. Any hope of surprise was lost. In their keenness to be as close to the action as possible, some of the picnickers had located themselves right in the path of the Federal advance and had to be persuaded to move. For most taking part, it was their first battle. The Union Army was easily the largest ever seen in North America. Outnumbered, the Confederates fell back. Casualties were heavy on both sides, partly because the soldiers were so inexperienced. The intense July heat did not help either. 22,000 Confederates were opposing 35,000 Union troops, twice as many as George Washington had led against the British at Yorktown during the War of Independence. The rifles of the infantrymen were much more accurate and could be reloaded much more quickly than the muskets of old, hence the greater casualties. The battle ebbed and flowed across the rich Virginia farmland, with the troops trampling underfoot the crops ready for harvesting. Few generals on either side at this stage of the war realized the enormous impact the new rifle would make. Just as the Union soldiers were beginning to tire, many of them had not eaten or drunk anything since early morning, the Confederates secretly switched fresh forces by train from the Shenandoah Valley. This was to make all the difference, though the Northern generals should have prevented it. The many-colored uniforms on both sides led to tragic confusion when, at a critical moment in the battle, some Northerners fired on their own men dressed in gray. Thereafter, blue became the standard Union color. The battle was America's most costly to date. Onslaught followed onslaught against the Union positions. Northerners for the first time were experiencing the rebel yell, a high-pitched wailing scream delivered on the run. Said a Federal soldier, "There is nothing like it this side of hell." Since the infantrymen had to bite open their own cartridges, strong front teeth were essential. By late afternoon, much of the Northern Army had had enough and began to withdraw. Sensing victory, the Confederates pressed home their advantage, and soon the Federal retreat became a rout. Though weary themselves, the Southerners fought on. The roads back to Washington became cluttered with fleeing civilians as well as panic-stricken troops. The Union retreat was dubbed later the Great Skedaddle. For a while, Washington seemed wide open, but the rebels were not organized sufficiently to follow up their remarkable victory. Many on the Southern side would rue the missed opportunity of Manassas forever. For Northerners, Manassas was a harsh awakening. Talk of a short war disappeared. They now knew they had a proper fight on their hands. For Southerners, a breathing space had been achieved in which to seek foreign recognition through the plane of the cotton card.
As part of the sense of self-confidence that the Southerners felt, they believed that cotton ruled the world, in fact. The British economy would collapse without cotton, and therefore the British government, to protect itself, would intervene on behalf of the South. France would do the same. Of course, this was totally false. There was no reason why the British economy could not keep going without cotton. As a matter of fact, what had occurred was that the crops had been so enormous for such a long period before this that there was an oversupply within the British warehouses. So the British didn't have to face this problem.
Even so, Britain and the North nearly came to blows on the high seas over the Union's efforts to deny the South foreign supplies. But no matter how hard the Northern sailors tried, the blockade was never wholly effective. Most Southern boats got through. While Union crews grew bored watching Confederate harbors, the captains of the blockade runners, many of them British, grew rich trading in luxuries that commanded premium prices in the South. Although wooden sailing vessels were still the most common, armored ships were coming in. The boat that was going to make all the difference in the naval war was the ironclad, and in this the North would have the edge. Called monitors, they were among the most bizarre sights of the age. A tin can on a shingle was how one contemporary derided them. Their significant feature was armor plating. The forerunners of these had first appeared during the Crimean War some years before. France had set the pace in their development, with Britain some way behind, and America nowhere. Now the conflict between North and South was to become a test bed for this revolution in naval warfare. The South was off the mark first, when they modified a wooden hulk named the Merrimac, which caused havoc among the blockading fleet near Norfolk, Virginia in early March 1862. By coincidence, the North's first Monitor reached the scene the very next day, and the first clash between ironclads began. For 4 hours, these two latter-day sea monsters threw everything at each other in one of the most unusual maritime combats ever witnessed. The shots simply bounced off each other's armor plating like peas from a pop gun, as one observer wrote. Since action photography had not been developed then, painters and engravers had a field day, as indeed they did at every major Civil War engagement. Not just the Atlantic coastline saw such clashes. By far the most important took place on the rivers of the West, particularly the Mississippi. Here, New Orleans is falling to Northern gunships. Coupled with Fort Henry's capture on the Tennessee earlier, the Union plan to drive the rebels from the Mississippi Valley had begun well. Taking the Confederate fort here at Donelson, near the Kentucky-Tennessee border, was more difficult. Sighted on higher ground, its guns wrought havoc on the Union fleet. But the Northern troops, commanded by a certain Ulysses S. Grant, who had come overland from Fort Henry, surrounded it and compelled its surrender. When asked for terms, Grant replied, "Only unconditional surrender can be accepted." He instantly acquired the nickname Unconditional Surrender Grant. The victories opened up the Confederacy's heartland to invasion. Within the month, the Union forces moved down the Tennessee River as far as here at Shiloh. Confident they had the rebels on the run, they did not dig any defenses, but the Southerners planned to surprise them.
The Battle of Shiloh started on the morning of April the 6th, 1862, about 2.5 miles to the southwest of here. Confederates attacking the Union forces and forcing them in this direction. During the morning, the battle went the way the Confederates wanted it to. They continually pushed the Union forces back. Finally, about 11 o'clock in the morning, the Union forces, a portion of them, dug in this area, which is the Hornet's Nest. We're actually standing in the sunken road, which borders one edge of the Hornet's Nest. The Confederates, when they hit this area, attacked across this open field and through the woods behind me. The attacks started about 11 in the morning, and they lasted until 5 o'clock in the afternoon. The commander in this area, the Union commander's orders were, hold your position at all costs, stop the Confederate attacks. The Confederates attacked 11 times, but they were never able to break the position. They finally brought up a battery of artillery, which started bombarding this area, pinning the Union forces down. This allowed the Confederates to move around them and surround them. However, the Union troops had done their job. Grant was able to build a defensive line back at Pittsburgh Landing, 2 miles to the northeast of us, and stopped the Confederate advance on the 6th, and on the morning of April the 7th, reinforced by Buell's Army of the Ohio, he moved out, forcing the Confederates to withdraw back toward Corinth.
Shiloh had an enormous impact. More men died here than in all the previous wars in which America had been involved. Declared the novelist Herman Melville, "What like a bullet can undeceive?" Shiloh was also the first Civil War battle to have a ballad written about it. In no other war in American history did music play such an important part.
Come all you valiant soldiers, a story I will tell about the bloody battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was an awful struggle and will cause your blood to chill. It was the famous battle that was fought on Shiloh Hill. It was the 6th of April, just at the break of day. The drums and fifes were playing for us to march away. About the hour of sunrise, the battle it began. And before the day had vanished, we fought them hand to hand. The wounded men were crying for help from everywhere, while others who were dying were offering God their prayer. protect my wife and children if it is thy holy will. Oh, such were the prayers I heard that night on Shiloh Hill. And early the next morning we were called to arms again, unmindful of the wounded, unuseful to the slain. The struggle was renewed and 10,000 men were killed. This was the second conflict of the famous Shiloh Hill. Before the day was ended, the battle ceased to roar, and thousands of brave soldiers had fell to rise no more. They left their vacant ranks for some other ones to fill, and now their moldering bodies all lie on Shiloh Hill.
Shiloh was an incredible battle. There's never been any wildest dreams by anyone that there could be anything like that. Shiloh was like Waterloo, and it came out of nowhere. It was just all of a sudden, there's a huge battle. Before that, there'd been Bull Run and Wilson's Creek, but they were skirmishes compared to Shiloh. And of course, Shiloh was followed very shortly by the 7 Days in Virginia, also a huge thing. And the realization that they had stepped into this buzzsaw must have been a terrible shock to everyone, soldiers and civilians alike. The losses were huge, of course, and they realized, and both sides had to say, oh my God, what are we in for?